One of the world's most drastic and puzzling measures of population control was established in China in 1979, the one-child policy. The name is self-explanatory. It is a policy that prohibits Chinese families from having more than one child. The policy arose in the aftermath of the rule of Mao Zedong. Mao led the Chinese Communist Revolution and founded the People's Republic of China. His rule left China's economy and population out of control. After Mao's death, China's people made up 50% of the world's population. However, that huge population was trying to live on just 7% of the world's land suitable for farming. At this point, the Communist Party ruling China decided that the situation called for desperate measures. They officially announced the one-child policy in an open letter in 1980. The policy would have many economic, social, and political consequences. In the mid-1900s, China was not the only country worried about their huge population. At this time, global population growth hit an all-time high. Worries began to mount about overpopulation as a hindrance to economic and political stability. This launched a global movement for population control that governments soon began to take part in. The first World Population Conference took place in Bucharest in 1974. Following the conference, governments in countries such as Bangladesh, Indonesia, and India implemented strict birth control campaigns, though they were short-lived. Meanwhile, China had already started moving towards population control under Mao, the revolutionary leader of the People's Republic of China. In the early 1960s, he established a birth planning commission. The original goal of the Birth Planning Commission was to reduce the country's growth rate from 2.7% to 1% by the year 2000. However, Mao lowered this goal repeatedly, eventually settling on 0.6% growth in cities and 1% in the country. Following the death of Mao Zedong in 1976, however, a post-revolutionary government took over, led by Deng Xiaoping. In this period of transition, the new government needed a political platform to gain legitimacy. Mao had gained his power through armed revolutions and forming the People's Republic, but the post-Mao government could not follow the same standard. Their platform instead became economic growth. Their goal was to gain power and legitimacy through growth in GDP. To accomplish this, they believed that decreasing the population size would directly cause an increase in per capita income and GDP. This was the context in which the one-child policy would emerge. The country, despite having been in a population crisis, already had a dropping population growth rate, and the government was grasping for economic stability. In 1978, the Chinese Communist Party was already encouraging families to only have one child. The policy was officially announced in 1980 along with rigid new demographic and economic goals. Economically, they wanted to increase GDP while also increasing per capita income to $1,000. Demographically, they wanted a population of 1.2 billion by the year 2000 with a 0% growth rate.
When the policy was officially announced in 1980, the Chinese government left the enforcement of the policy to the provinces. The State Family Planning Commission used a birth quota to set a population target for the entire country. From this population goal, they would allocate the number of children allowed to be born in each province. Then, provincial officials would assign local officials a number of children to be born in their areas. The local officials, who were under financial pressure to make sure the birth quota were not exceeded, would collaborate with government-appointed family planning groups, or cadres, in order to select families to authorize to have a child. The selected families would then receive birth permits. There were some incentives provided to people so that they would adhere to the policy. For example, longer maternity leaves and other benefits would be offered to people with only one child. There were also severe consequences to breaking the policy. A heavy fine called a social maintenance fee was often imposed on people who had extra children. The fine was dependent on the family's income and could be as great as 50% of the family's income for 5 to 14 years. The cost would be even greater for a third child. Sociologist Li found in a case study of the Hebei province in the early 1980s that about half the women who disregarded their one-child certificate and had a second child were fined, but the fine was very heavy, and they were not able to pay it off. If a couple fails to pay the fine, their second child would not be allowed to be documented on the family's household registration, removing many of their rights, such as access to education. In order to prevent extra births from happening in the first place, local officials took physical extreme measures. If a pregnant couple was unable to produce a birth permit upon request, the woman would be forced to have an abortion and an IUD inserted. If a fetus survived an abortion, they would be discarded into a waste receptacle and would die. If a couple had an extra child and was discovered when it was born, the newborns would often be suffocated in jars designed especially for these purposes. Some clinics would even boil water to kill unauthorized babies. The humane method involved injecting alcohol into the baby's head as soon as it emerged from the mother's body. Doctors or midwives refusing to perform these tasks would lose their jobs or face a cut in their salary. Even when unauthorized children were born at home, family planning cadres would sometimes find out and come kill the baby in cold blood. The one-child policy exempted some families from having just one child. For example, those in rural areas were sometimes allowed to have another child if their first was female. The rationale behind this was that rural families needed more children to work the fields. Further, China has a preference for boys because the males carry on the family name. Ethnic minorities in China were also allowed to have more than one child, as the policy was mostly aimed at the Han majority. 35% of all Chinese were allowed to have more than one child during the one-child policy. In the recent years, China has loosened up on the policy. In 2013, some of the exceptions the Chinese government has allowed are: 1. The couple has just one child who is handicapped or unable to work because of non-hereditary diseases. 2. Both parents are only children themselves and have just one child so far. 3. The couple adopted their first child because one of them was diagnosed as infertile. The results of these exceptions is uneven and unfair family sizes that varied throughout each province. The one-child policy had a big impact on many aspects of Chinese society. First, it created a big gender imbalance in which there are many millions of missing girls. Due to China's cultural preference for boys and the one-child policy, many families decided to abort girls in favor of a boy. In 2010, the Chinese census found the sex ratio at birth was 118 males for every 100 females. The gender imbalance means that a lot of Chinese men are unable to find wives. They become therefore less productive and more likely to commit crime. China's crime rate nearly doubled between 1992 and 2004. Studies found that a 1% increase in the ratio of males to females equates to an increase in violent and property crime of almost 6%. The one-child policy also has consequences like changing views towards deep-rooted Chinese traditions, such as filial piety. Filial piety is a huge part of Chinese culture, and in 1979, there was even a law that stated a person could be imprisoned for 5 years if they abandoned their parents. However, in the recent years, parents of one-child families are becoming more and more concerned about being abandoned in old age. In a study done on rural Chinese villages in the Jiangsu province, researchers noted a growing discrepancy between elderly parents who preferred to live with children and those who expected it. This basically says that people who wanted to live with their children but didn't expect it. The study also found that elders were having a more positive view of elderly care institutions, which were heavily stigmatized and restricted in the past due to strong ideas of filial piety in Chinese society. This change in perspective towards elderly care institutions and filial piety may be attributed to the fact that it is a lot harder for only children to take care of their parents, as well as their spouse and children, than it is for non-only children. The mental health of only children in China is also being researched. Only children are often considered to be more spoiled and impulsive than non-only children. A study that compared non-only children and only children in China found that the latter were less likely to take risks. This is because they receive all the attention and coddling from their parents when they are younger. When they enter college, only children try to avoid challenges and obstacles because they are unused to dealing with the world without their parents. This article suggests that non-only children confront these challenges and therefore become emotionally and mentally stronger. The result is that non-only children thrive better emotionally and financially later on in life. The study also found that only children have low confidence and higher depression than non-only children. Parents of only children often have very high expectations of them because they only have one child. Therefore, many only children are overwhelmed with stress to reach those expectations. Later on in life, when their parents are elderly, only children also face the problems of supporting their parents by themselves. The importance of the mentality of only children in China cannot be underestimated. Many of the children impacted by the one-child policy are in their late 30s and early 40s currently. They are the social and economic backbone of China. If they have poor mental health, this affects the entire country and its economy.
One of the biggest impacts the OCP has had on China's economy is a disappearing work population. China has a rapidly aging population. In 2015, 1 in 10 Chinese were over the age of 65, and that number is likely to rise to 20% by 2035. This is due to the fact that people are living longer, and thanks to the OCP, there is lack of young people to replace the elderly leaving the workforce. As a result, China is facing a crisis of not having enough incoming workers to replace the leaving older generations. Despite this concern, looking at the numbers, China's economy seems to be doing very well. Infrastructure investment has surged, the property market is doing well, and personal consumption has been active in comparison to other years. In 2016, its economy grew by 6.7%, just barely missing their 7% goal. When the OCP was implemented in 1980, the government set a goal to increase per capita income from $250 to $1,000. In 2000, the per capita income was $8,000, showing how China's economy has boomed. However, these numbers don't tell the whole story. China's economic growth was not a healthy growth. China's economic growth for the past decade or so has been fueled most entirely by the state. The government had its investment spending up to 20%, double what it was in 2011. While private sector investment went from 40% in 2011 to just 2.8% in 2016. This government-led approach is not sustainable. State-owned companies leading the investment charge are both highly indebted and much less efficiently run. Also, China's economic growth is not a result of the one-child policy. More people, not fewer, was one of the reasons for China's boom. The country's rise as a manufacturing powerhouse could not have happened without abundant, cheap labor from workers born during the 1960s and 70s baby boom, before the one-child policy. Many economists argue that China's rapid economic rise had more to do with Beijing's move to encourage foreign investment and private entrepreneurship. The Chinese government, aware of the economic decline due to the one-child policy, has made a policy change in hopes of reviving the economy. The National Health and Family Planning Commission has claimed that the OCP prevented 400 million births, but Chinese demographers Wang Feng, Cai Yong, and Gu Baocheng argue that the number is not more than half. Urbanization and rising living costs would have reduced birth rates naturally, as they have in South Korea and Japan. Furthermore, with Mao's previous emphasis on population control, the growth rate was already declining. This causes many people to question whether or not the OCP was effective or necessary.
Xinhua, the official news agency, reported in October 2015 that China will fully implement a policy of allowing each couple to have 2 children as an active response to the aging population, but said the implementation and timing would be up to the provinces. This was to raise the fertility rates, but it may not work.
China Daily reported at the end of 2015 that 90 million Chinese couples would be eligible to have a second child, but it appears that only a fraction will choose to do so. In late 2013, the government announced that adults who were an only child could have 2 children, but of the 11 million eligible citizens, only 1.5 million have applied to have a second child. This suggests that the 2-child policy may not lead to a baby boom. There is a mix of responses from Chinese citizens. However, it seems that the majority of China's population are skeptical of the new 2-child policy. Many said that taking care of one child was enough work. Chen Feng, a 36-year-old woman who works at a medical equipment company, says, "Before I had my first child, I was hoping for the relaxation of the one-child policy. I changed my mind after I gave birth to my daughter. It takes a lot of energy to take care of a child, and you want to make sure that the child will have a good future. So my husband and I have decided not to have a second child."
All in all, the one-child policy had big impacts on China, economically and socially, and has served as a mechanism for achieving political goals. It has left China with problems like a huge aging population and a major gender imbalance. With these major consequences, the necessity and effectiveness of the policy is still being debated to this day.